Thank you, and thank you for everyone for coming along. I can't believe another year's gone by. Here we are again, measuring our own longevity as a forum. And thank you to Stuart too. I was very keen that we got someone to come along and talk about the longevity trends that underpin this topic. And I think it's just useful to go back about why, for instance, I was interested in this topic of longevity. As an economist, I hear a lot about an aging society. And I always say to people, I don't know how many of you fist bump when you hear about an aging society. No one does. They always get very miserable about an aging society. Because you always go straight to thinking about a rising number of old people. We think about end of life, and we think about decline. And I think that's to mislead what is the real challenge we face. The challenge we face is not that there's a growing number of older people, that is a challenge, but actually that we need to adapt to the length of life that we can now expect. We just need a new system. Now, if you focus on that longevity society, not an aging society, a number of things come out. The first is, as well as all the problems, there's an opportunity. This is ultimately good news. We have more time. And how to make the most of that time. There's an Irish saying that says, don't complain about getting old, many have been denied the privilege. We live at a remarkable moment in human history. We look at those life expectancies Stuart was talking about. Wow, that's extraordinary. So there are challenges, but there's opportunities. The second thing I think it's important when you move away from focusing on older people to the length of life, is you start to realize that aging is a process, not an event. You don't suddenly become old on one particular birthday. We age over our lifetime. And so it's really important, if you're going to think about aging well, not to just focus on people who are 80, but to go back across the life course. And Stuart's statistics showing the improvements at older ages and the deteriorations at younger ages is absolutely a key part of that. Because it's not just mortality that's rising, but if your health is deteriorating or aging fast in your 20s and 30s, that doesn't bode well for the future. So a forward-looking perspective. And then the third thing is it's about a real systems change. It isn't just about GLP-1 drugs, it's about so many other things that we will cover here today. Because, the ONS, rightly or wrongly, says that half of children born today will live to be in their early 90s. And we just haven't designed our institutions to support that length of life. So how do we invest in the second half of life? How do we invest in human capital over a second half of life when that is now what we can expect to live to? We need to change how we age. When you get life expectancy going from 40 to 50 to 60 to 70, it's great, but it doesn't really necessarily change your idea of what the life course should be. But when you're talking about going to in your 90s, it does change things. Now, one of the things we're going to look at today is actually how do we pay for a longer life? And that's going to lead on to my discussion about the state pension age, which the UK government is about to look at. I think it's a quinquennial process where they review, or 3-year process, review the state pension age. And we all know, because of this aging society and more old people, the state pension is under challenge. So I'm going to very briefly talk about life expectancy. I'm going to then say why a focus on the state pension age is misleading, and it's to do with systems change, and then I'll say something about what we should focus on. Brilliantly, Stuart's covered this already, but as a professor I find repetition's a key teaching tool, so I'm just going to very quickly say the same thing again. Look, this is going from 1922 up to 2022. You have this extraordinary process of improvement in life expectancy, and you can see a very stable linear trend. And then the last 10 years, it starts to flatten out, it worsens because of COVID, and it comes back up. And as Stuart said, it looks like we're about to just go above the previous peak. So extraordinary gains in life expectancy. Now, when I first got interested in longevity, I thought, life expectancy is a great thing. And then I started talking to actuaries and statisticians. They hate the concept. And I begin to see why, because it's a complicated topic. So this is me trying to explain a complicated topic. So if you think about life expectancy, I want you to think of it like a collapsible telescope. Okay, so this telescope's got 4 segments. So basically, if you want to increase life expectancy, you can raise the probability of going from a newborn to 25. You can raise the probability of going from 25 to 50, or 50 to 75, or 75 to 100. And obviously, the more you extend every segment, the greater is life expectancy. So bear that in mind, because what we've got here is survival rates in the UK. This is the probability of a newborn making it to different ages in 1922 and 2022. I have older data than Stuart. And the area under this curve is actually life expectancy. Now, what you'll notice, and Stuart's talked about some worrying trends here, but what's basically happened is those first 2 or 3 segments of the telescope have been fully extended. The probability of a newborn now making it to 50 is remarkably high compared to 100 years ago. And what that means is if you want to carry on raising life expectancy, first of all, you've got to make sure those earlier segments don't contract, which is what Stuart's concern was. But also, you're going to only get life expectancy gains now from segment 3 and segment 4, going from 50 to 75 and 75 to 100. But if you look at this chart, even the probability going to 50 to 75 is pretty high. So what we're seeing increasingly is life expectancy gains globally in the rich countries is coming about from pulling out that 4th segment. The probability of going from 70 to 80, 80 to 90, 90 to 100. Now, why that's important is a couple of things. First of all, it means you will see a slowdown in life expectancy trends. So across the high-income countries, life expectancy trends seem to be doing an increase of 1 year every 10 years, not 2 years, other than the UK and the US where we have problems. But that's not to say that life expectancy progress is stalling. What it means now is that it's all about longevity. It's really the predominant growth in life expectancy is coming from the chances of going from 70 to 90 or 70 to 100. And that, of course, is what's raising challenges in our health system and challenges in our pension system. So, the scope for life expectancy increase is still there, even if it's going to be less. In the UK, it's more because we're below other countries and we had this problem in earlier years. We will see life expectancy slow down, but that doesn't mean longevity is not an issue. In fact, it's the very opposite. It means it's all now about longevity. And the way we've set things up, all this longevity increase is happening more and more after the state pension age. We're having more and more years in retirement. So in 1925, when the state pension age was set up, at 65, a man could expect to live another 11 years. And I think, by the way, it was only men could get the state pension then, which is why I put it there. Today, at 66, you can expect another 17 and a half years, and that's slightly less than the number Stuart showed for pensioners. So you can see the challenge. We're living a lot longer after retirement. We also now, because of an ageing population, in 1925, only 5% of the population were over 65. Today, it's 20%. So you've got this growing problem, and that's compounded by the fact in 1922, the pension was around 10% of median wages. Today, it's around 30%. So all of these things, longevity, demographic bulges, and a rising, I won't say generosity, but a rising amount of money for the pension is creating a challenge. And this goes back to my book, The 100 Life, where we just said a very simple, logical statement, which is if you're living for longer, you need more resources unless you're going to see a fall in your standard of living. And that really means you're going to have to work for longer. Saving more doesn't actually give you more resources unless the interest rate's incredibly high. It just shuffles when you have your money. So the only way to solve this conundrum is if we get massive productivity growth from AI, and who knows if that will happen or if we'll get employed, we just don't know. But absent those changes, the only thing you can do to make sure you have the same standard of living over a lifetime is to work for longer. And it's sort of just an unpleasant, logical truth. You can't do anything about it. But what I want to say is that's misleading just to then go, all right, we've got to raise the state pension age. That cannot be the starting point for this conversation. And I want to stress that because I think the challenge we've got is we think, oh look, our social security systems are unstable, we must make them stable. But you don't get people to change their behaviour to try and make national systems sustainable. The systems are there to help the population. So how do we go to our state pension and say, well, what reforms do we need to support people given the life they're now going to live if they're living to 80, 90 or 100? If people don't want to have children, then why would you make them have children just to make the pension system sustainable? It's completely the wrong way around of thinking about our social institutions. So we need to step back and say, what is needed and what is the challenge? I'm going to say that not that raising the state pension age isn't part of the solution. Of course it is. I think we will have to work for longer, but that's not the same thing as only raising the state pension age. And in setting the state pension age, we have to think about differences in life expectancy by income, that what matters is healthy life expectancy, not life expectancy. Uncertainty about how long we live for is a really important thing when you think about when you retire. And then finally, can you actually work? So let me just start off about the profound inequalities in life expectancy. Stuart has already mentioned it. I was actually born in Enfield. I've never seen Enfield mentioned in any national chart, but there we go. It's an outlier, which I'm not going to talk about today. But look at the difference. It's a 10-year difference in life expectancy between the lowest income decile neighbourhoods and the highest income decile neighbourhoods. And if you look at those life expectancy trends that Stuart was talking about, basically the problems are occurring at the bottom and not the top. So we're fortunate here, we're seeing our life expectancy carry on rising broadly, but we're seeing declines or static at bottom. And so if you just keep raising the state pension age, that's a problem if you're at the bottom. Already the state pension age is regressive. Obviously the longer you live for, the more the state pension you get. And this says based on where you are in the income distribution, how much do you get in terms of lifetime state pension payments? And it already skews, as it would do, of course, to those of higher income because they have higher life expectancy. Obviously, you'll just be chipping away at that if you just raise the state pension age. But this is the biggest challenge. UK, again, not only is bad on life expectancy, but bad on this chart. I'm sorry to be all so dismal. I mean, there's problems and there's opportunities. In general, in most countries, healthy life expectancy is a constant proportion of life expectancy. So the more years you live, you get more years of good health, but more years of bad health. But in the UK, looking at the official data, although life expectancy is rising at a slower rate, healthy life expectancy has not been keeping in place. And if you look at any simple model of a life cycle in economics, whether you want to work or not depends on a number of things. It obviously depends upon do you need the money, but also depends upon how healthy you are. And if you're not healthy, it's very hard to carry on working. So we mustn't just index the state pension age to life expectancy. We need to think about it as a function of healthy life expectancy. I'm very keen on this as an idea because at the moment the Treasury has no incentive to keep us healthy for longer. And it says, oh, you're living for longer, that's a problem, I'm going to have to make you work for longer. We've really got to have a system that says, how do I keep people healthy for longer? So we can then think about a health system that's delivering health outcomes and not just keeping us living longer, but with more and more age-related diseases. So healthy life expectancy is the key thing. The other thing, and this is sort of, Stuart and I can have a nerd fest over this chart later, and forgive me for the rather somber nature of this chart, but this is looking at the age at which adults die in the UK, adult males. And it shows from 1990 to 2020 a remarkable shift. In 30 years, you can see the peak has shifted. But there's a lot of uncertainty around. And if you're totally risk neutral about your life, then life expectancy is a great number to look at. But if I think about when I want to choose to retire, it's a very different if I know I'm going to die at 80 compared to a 50% chance of dying at 60 and a 50% chance dying at 100. I'd be really pissed off if you increase the state pension age to 60 and that's when I die. So we've got to think about this uncertainty, not just the inequality, but this uncertainty around it. And that uncertainty about, average life, very few people die at the average. I always say to my students, if you've got one hand in the freezer, one hand in a pot of boiling water, on average you're doing fine. Averages can be very, very misleading, and no more so when it comes to longevity. But this is the real thing. This is the thing where I'm really sort of pushing ministries of finance around the world and getting a lot of traction. Because this shows you, for the United States, it's a very similar picture for the UK, the percentage of people working at every age. Okay? And so you can see at around 50, just over 80% of people are working. By the time you're getting down to the state pension age, you're down to around 20, 30% of people working. And it just strikes me as blindingly obvious that if you think, oh, let's just raise the state pension age, that's going to solve a problem, it really isn't, because most people aren't working by that time. Look at that decline. So why do we see this drop-off in employment from 50 to 65? For a few, it's because they got a lovely defined benefit and they can retire, but not for many. This is about health. These people become ill, they exit the labour market. If you exit the labour market in your 50s, it's very hard to come back in again. It may not be about your health, it may be you've got to care for someone and you've got to leave the labour market for that reason. It may be your skills are out of date, or firms are ageist, or they don't offer age-friendly jobs. But this is the thing we really have to focus on. And when I say the challenge is how do we work for longer, yes, raising the state pension age probably has something to do with this problem. But look at that decline. Working for longer is how do we get people who are 50, 83% chance of working, to say 65% chance of working when they're 65. That seems politically far less toxic. It also seems to say to people, you know what, rather than say you've got to work for longer, I'm going to think, how do I support you working for longer? Go back to what I was saying about changing our system. We've got to invest in human capital in the second half of our life. How do I make sure you've got the health and the skills and the opportunity to keep working? To say, oh, I'm just going to raise a state pension age, but do none of that, and Stuart showed us some of the health data, is really unfair, and in a way, you can see why people would protest. If you don't make it easier for me to work for longer, but you're demanding I work for longer, that really sucks. I call it Samuel Beckett economics. I can't go on, I must go on, I will go on. That can't be the basis of our pension policy. So we need to think about creating age-friendly jobs, supporting health, and a lot of that's going to be about prevention. We have a health system that focuses a lot upon getting people who are out of work into work, but actually keeping people in work is key. I say at the end, if you could half that rate of decline from 50 plus down to 65, it's a 4% boost to GDP every single year. That's the nearest thing I can think of to a macroeconomic free lunch, and it's why ministers of finance are getting more and more interest in that. I just want to come back again to another part of this, and Stuart had a chart on health expenditure which has the same sort of message. Auguste Comte, the 19th century demographer, said, demography is not destiny. The trouble with that ageing society story, it says, oh, it's all these old people, they're just a problem. A longevity society says we can change how we age. And what's remarkable, the more you look at the data, the more you see that actually most of our public finance problems are not really driven by a number of older people. It's the choices we are making. So Stuart, with that rising health expenditure share, the majority of that is actually to do with high rising costs and lack of productivity in the health sector rather than more old people. This is analysis, I think, by the OBR, maybe someone else. And what you've got here is that purple bit is the increase in the state pension due to the increase in the number of people aged over 65. And the turquoise is the amount that's been driven by the triple lock. This is a great example of demography is not destiny. And this raises a very complicated issue, of course, with the number of people over 65. But I'm going to come on to that in a second. Let me just summarise. The problem with the state pension age thinking is it's very much three-stage life thinking. You educate, you have a career, and then you retire. As I wrote in The 100-Year Life, we need to think about multiple stages to a career, and just changing a parameter, the state pension age, is not systems change, it won't work, particularly when most people aren't working after 50. We need to invest in human capital in later years, both as individuals and as a system. That's how we avoid a health and a pensions crisis. If we don't change how we age, we have a health crisis, we have a pensions crisis. If we seize the opportunity of longer lives, invest in human capital, now they have such a high chance of living so long, it seems to be a good opportunity. But the heart of all of this, which I think is a really tricky thing, which is why the state pension age is so complicated, is that a simple reliance upon chronological age doesn't work. And that's what we're wrestling with. It's not just that 70 is the new 60 or whatever you want to talk about, just people age really differently. Some of that is due to income inequalities, some of it may be genetics, but people age really differently. And that's the problem we've got to face, because you wouldn't say everyone age 40 needs this. And why does everyone over 65 get categorized as the same? And that's the real challenge we face. So when we think about our pension system, we've got to think, what is the problem we're really trying to solve? Because being over 65 no longer necessarily means that you're poor or financially insecure. So that's the real challenge we have to face. How do we rewire away from chronological age? Starting with a state pension age, to me, seems lazy. It solves the Treasury's pension problem. It doesn't solve society's problem. How do we actually work for longer? So that's my conclusions on the state pension age, and where I think it's just both politically controversial and actually not going to yield much in the way of gains. We need a much more systems-based approach. Thank you very much.